Okay, let's continue now. Coming back to my problem, I got on one side this big 3D parallel code, on the other side this big chemical scheme. What do I do? If I cannot afford to pay billions of points, and that's the case in general, I have to use another method. There are two methods I want to describe. The first one is this tabulation method. The second one will be the reduced scheme approach. The tabulation method is based on this idea coming from Manifold, and again here the big guy there is Steve Pope from Cornell, that even so you have a lot of variables, and I know that Moshe Matalon talked about that last year because I saw his course yesterday, so I suspect you should have seen it last year. Even so, you have a lot of independent variables in the system. In many cases, these variables are not spreading over the whole domain of parameter. They end up following a given shape, a manifold here, and then that allows you to describe a system where you have 300 species. Maybe you need only 3, 4, or 5 independent variables to describe it. This idea that, well, you can check that in different cases. This is a manifold, obtained here from Matthias Immer, and you can find it in the proceedings again of the last symposium where Steve Pope gave a description of that. You have here the species, you see, and on this manifold, the points won't be here or here or there or there. Most of the points will be found on the manifold, which has a much smaller dimension. So that looks like an attractive idea to be able to put that in a code. In practice, it's not that easy, because a manifold means basically that you should be able to tabulate everything as a function of an advanced progress variable or a mixture fraction or some chemical variable. And so you cannot have manifolds with shapes like this one or that one. So choosing which quantities can be used to build a manifold is a problem. Let me give you some simple examples. The first assumption that we need to use when you do that is that we're going to assume that the manifold, which is followed by a flame in a laminar flow, is the same in a turbulent flow. That's not obvious at all. And no one seems to discuss that. In practice, I know that people have problems with that. I've mentioned this problem of Lewis numbers, for example. In a laminar flame, all the species must diffuse because of molecular transport. So if a species A wants to meet a species B, they meet by molecular transport only. In a turbulent flow, it's possible that A will be carried by an eddy towards B, and they will meet in a different way, in which case, along the manifold, they would be at a different place. But this is the main assumption we do. We say, no, this is not going to happen. Anything which happens in a laminar flow will happen in a turbulent flow too. In other words, these two lines here, the trajectories for a laminar flame, the trajectory for a turbulent flame will be the same. That's a very important assumption. Like I would call it a universality of manifold in combustion. Which variables do you need to describe a manifold? Well, in many cases, for example, for a premix flame, you use the sum of the CO mass fraction and the CO2 mass fraction. And by the way, you see that it's not as simple as it could be. You could say, why don't we use only CO2? Well, if you use only CO2, it doesn't work because there are equilibrium between CO and CO2. And you find out that using CO2 only does not give you a usable manifold. You need to use CO and CO2. So you build a progress variable now, which is not T minus T1 divided by T2 minus T1, but it's based on this expression here. So just to make my point again, we use two assumptions here. The first assumption is that in a laminar flame, if you want to compute a reaction rate, for example, which depends on 300 species, you can actually tabulate it only with two variables, typically the progress variable and the mixture fraction. That's the first assumption. Okay? You use the same assumption for a turbulent flow. You also assume that in a turbulent flow, all the reaction rates you need, which depend on a lot of species, depend only on two, actually. And I like it as a computer guy. Well, not a computer guy, but my students are doing the computations. Because here, instead of n species, you have only two. That's very good. But we need the last assumption. We need to assume that these two manifolds are the same, because otherwise, it's no use to do that, okay? And the idea is that we're going to use a manifold measured in a laminar flame, and the question will be which flame, to use it in a turbulent flow. That's the main idea of the whole show here. So what we'll do is that we take a laminar flame, not even this one, which is a 2D flame. You can use a planar flame, a stretch flame, whatever. You will compute a table with that, where C and Z are the entries and the reaction rate is the output. And then in the 3D code, you add one conservation equation for C and Z, and you read this table to guess what the reaction rate is. Simple. And actually quite elegant, because you can claim that you have the whole chemistry embedded in this table. And the nice thing is that if you have C and Z, after that you have all the other quantities. After the computation, if someone tells you, oh, what is the CO level, what is the NOx level, well, you just go there, because if you have tabulated the reaction rate, you can also tabulate the NOx, the CO, the OH, whatever. So when you use the tabulation methods, by the way, as a post-processing tool, you can have access to all these things. But you still pay only for 2 quantities, okay? Pay for 2, you get 300. A good deal. Except in practice, for example, NO is difficult to get, because NO is produced far away in the burn gases, and in the manifold it's a singular point. So if you want NO, you cannot do that. On the paper you can, but in practice you can't. Now, this question of universality of manifolds raises a lot of points. The first question is basically, how do you create the manifold, the table? For example, you can create it by using a flame in a perfectly stirred reactor in 0D. So you take cold flow, variable temperatures, you let it burn, and you measure at each instant the reaction rate versus the mixture fraction, or versus the progress variable. And this gives you one table. But you could do also the same thing for a diffusion flame, laminar, or for a premix flame. Which table should you use? Well, that's the whole point. In practice, this doesn't work. You need to measure your tabulations, usually either in diffusion flames or in premix flames, with a range of equivalence ratio if you want to cover everything. And of course, as I said, this question here remains the main question. And I don't think anyone has really answered that for the moment. So this idea of tabulation is actually an idea which is completely, fully justified in certain cases. And I want to show here 2 examples where actually just by using COE you can prove that it's a good idea. And then I will also show you cases where we have to use more than 1 variables, because here for diffusion flames or perfectly premix flame you can do everything with only 1 tabulation variable. Then we'll use 2, and then I will show you examples which don't work, and unfortunately it's usually the real cases, okay? That makes sense. So the simplest tabulation I've already described yesterday. If you assume, that's always the same thing, if you assume that you have the Lewis number equal to unity, constant pressure, if you have only 2 streams feeding your combustor, then you have seen yesterday that you can use the Z diagram. And the Z diagram is the simplest tabulation method in the world. It's just, you don't need to tabulate anything. You just go here and read the data from the Z diagram. So if you want to use a 3D code with infinitely fast chemistry, again, I talked about that yesterday, you will solve for density and velocity and for mixture fraction. Once you have Z, you will just go here, and the tabulation, if I can say so, will tell you, okay, if Z is here, this is the oxidizer mass fraction, and this is the fuel mass fraction. So this is the simplest tabulation you can imagine. And this will work if chemistry is infinitely fast, because these diagrams are written for infinitely fast chemistry. And if you only have 2 streams feeding the combustor. So typically, again, you have to remember that when we do that, we are assuming that any small flame here looks actually like this flame here computed with infinitely fast chemistry. At each point, these 2 things are supposed to match. If you have the same Z, you have the same fuel mass fraction in both cases. Now, it means also that we know right away that there are cases where this does not work. For example, here, this is a jet of fuel in air, and this is the stoichiometric line, and here this is the temperature. Or no, this is the reaction rate, sorry. So you see right away that downstream, down there, up there, probably you can use infinitely fast chemistry because you see the flame is ignited and it's okay, but if you are here at the bottom of the flame, there is absolutely no combustion yet. So obviously, the tabulation there won't work. You cannot use only 1 variable here. That makes sense. I mean, you shouldn't use a tabulation based on infinitely fast chemistry if the flame is not infinitely fast. That sounds like a simple statement, but I've seen quite a few people, trying to use this assumption in cases where you can't. And of course, if you're using infinitely fast chemistry here, the flame will start here. The flame will be stabilized on the burner. That would not work. Now, even now, if the flame is ignited, infinitely fast chemistry is usually not sufficient. This is a DNS here, where you're looking at the infinitely fast chemistry lines. in the box here where you have a flame, a turbulent diffusion flame between the two streams here. And you see that the points are not all located here on the infinity fast chemistry line. You have points a little bit everywhere here. And the experiments give you the same result, actually. You find points here, for example, for this flame E, which comes from again, the famous TNF workshop organized by Sandia. You see the flames are not all of them, not all points are on the infinity fast chemistry lines. And that means that you need to introduce more things if you want to be realistic there. One of the first things you need to introduce in these flames is stretch. We talked about stretch yesterday, and we know that the flame structure depends on stretch. We know, for example, that for infinity fast chemistry, that would correspond to 0 stretch, you are here, but when the stretch increases, then these lines move. So you would need to tabulate things not only as a function of Z, but also as a function of stretch or of scalar dissipation. As I said yesterday, stretch, scalar dissipation for diffusion flames, they play the same role. So that means now, instead of tabulating only as a function of Z, right away you see that you need to introduce Z and the scalar dissipation. So that means you need to tabulate these flames now, for example, in a stretch diffusion flame, you will store the reaction rate as a function of Z and scalar dissipation. One more variable. Is stretch really the only extension? Well, not really, actually. In a flame like this, you see it's really not really a problem of stretch, it's a problem of age. Here you have a young flame, not yet ignited, and it's getting older, then it's igniting, then it's getting even more old. And the point here is that if you think of it in a Lagrangian way, you see that the age of the flamelets would be a good thing to incorporate. That's difficult to do. Some models try to do, actually. The CMC model, for example, are basically trying to say that when you are here, you are on the mixing line, but when you go up, you move in this domain, and at the top, you end up here with the infinity fast chemistry. And so this is measured by the age. Another way to do it in CMC is to have a second characterization that depends on the location. So you can actually move in your diagram from one point to another. CMC models, unfortunately, they multiply the number of species by the number of bins they take in each species. So instead of 10 species, you end up with 200. So that's a very complicated extension. Okay, let me move now to the only other examples where you know that tabulation method will work, and it's the perfectly premixed flame, again, assuming that the flame is lean, and assuming only that you need to track the fuel here, and that pressure is constant. And again, I will assume that the Lewis number is unity, I guess, in the next slide. So if you have an expression for the reaction rate, which is like this one, this term will be almost constant because the oxygen, there's enough oxygen everywhere, so the only important parameter is that one. If you suppose that the Mach number is small, pressure is constant, we've done that, Moshe has done it, you can prove that you only have one variable in this flow, which is the progress variable, which is either the temperature change or the fuel mass fraction change. And most cases for turbulent premixed flames, we work only with the progress variable. And if you write here the expression of the reaction rate with single step reaction, this is what you find. And what this expression is really telling you is that the progress variable here is the only parameter controlling the reaction rate. So that's a proof that the tabulation method will work. This is independent of laminar or turbulent, and it proves that if you want to compute a reaction rate, you can get it by this expression. So there is not even a reason to compute it in the code. You can tabulate it before. You just make a table where you put theta and reaction rate, and that's the simplest tabulation you can find in the world. So that means that if you look at a premixed flame, this is a picture here coming from École Centrale, a turbulent premixed flame, you're going to be using here an expression for the reaction rate, which is exactly the same that one you would have in a laminar flame, and there are good reasons to do that. Good reasons to do that if the Lewis number is equal to unity, blah, 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 etc. And again, once you have said that this is true for Lewis number, unity, constant pressure, etc., you do the same thing when Lewis number is not unity, and you assume it's still going to work, which is an assumption that you cannot really demonstrate, but you hope it's going to work. Just a feature, again, which is interesting about tabulation methods, especially if you write a code, is that tabulation methods have this nice characteristic that the reaction rates are stored in a table and they only correspond to physical values because they come from a laminar flame. They don't have stupid values there. If you use reaction rates based on Arrhenius rate, especially with this kind of very dangerous expressions where you have exponentials, and if you solve explicitly for YF, YO, and temperature, you can have stupid values in a method which is based on Arrhenius reaction rates. Because, for example, if YF gets negative, the whole thing won't mean anything. So in practice, if you write a code with a tabulation method, it's more stable. You have less problems. That's a good feature of this method. So this expression will always give a physically reasonable reaction rate because it comes from a table that you created yourself. So if normally you're smart enough not to put stupid values there. While this one can go anywhere. And you know, with an exponential, it's easy to go to places you shouldn't have been. That means also that since you have a very stable method with the tabulation to compute the reaction rate, you can use less points in your flame front. That's also very nice because you're saving on resolution, you're saving on the cost of the. Now, premixed lean flames and infinity fast chemistry, diffusion flames are not sufficient. In practice, in most cases today, people are trying to work with cases where you have two variables to describe this manifold. One of them is the progress variable, C. The second one is the mixture fraction. So you can write tabulations based on these two things. That means in your code, you will advance C and Z. And from these two guys here and the tabulation, then you will have all the other species and all the reaction rates. There are quite a few groups here working on that. FPI and FGM are basically the same method, except they fight to know who did it first. It's kind of interesting when you read the reviews. You have to be careful again that even so you tabulate things with two variables. For example, you tabulate it in an adiabatic flame. So if the flow is not adiabatic, if you have losses near the walls, it won't work. It's not going to work. You're using Z here. You have to believe that Z exists. Again, you see that Z exists only for equal Lewis number. And Z exists only if you have two streams feeding your combustor. Still, for many canonical cases in the last years, we have seen that tabulation methods have been quite efficient. They work. There are quite a few people working on that. I suspect in this room there are probably people working on that. And that's a good way to look at the problem despite the approximations that I mentioned. Now, what are the limits of tabulation methods? And that's an interesting point here, is that we use tabulation methods a lot for academic flames, but when we need to go to real flames, that seems more difficult. One of the reasons for that, again, is coming from the HPC side. You have this table which has two entries now, C and Z. But we know that you need to add things. For example, in real systems, the pressure will change in a piston engine. So you need to tabulate as C, Z, and P now. But in an engine also, if you have more than two streams entering the chamber, you need to define more than one mixture fraction. So you have 2 or 3 mixture fractions. If you are non-adiabatic, you need to add the heat losses. So you have 6. And the size of the table becomes too big to fit on one processor. We've seen that quite often. And then you're stuck. So you're not stuck because of your idea is good, but the way you implement it won't work. On a Blue Gene machine, the memory is not that big. So your system will work on your PC on a small mesh. When you will bring it to a big machine, the memory will not be sufficient to carry your database with you. And then the problem you have also is that when you know all these things, you don't really know on which flame you should tabulate. Should you take a diffusion flame? Should you take a premix flame? And that things get really complicated here. I've shown this example yesterday. This is a Siemens gas turbine in which you inject fuel a little bit everywhere and air a little bit everywhere. And you have heat losses. For example, at the nozzle here, at the entry here, we know that the heat losses are very important. So here, if you need to tabulate things, the table just becomes too big. And the way to tabulate things becomes just too complicated. So this is why, actually, piston engine is the same, okay? Piston engine here, the size of the database becomes really too large. And people are coming back from tabulation for that. So this is why you go in certain cases, this is what we also explored to reduce schemes. So what are reduced schemes here? Here the idea is to say, okay, I'm not going to tabulate things. I want to keep something which looks exactly like a chemical scheme, but I would like, please, to have less reactions and less species. So typically, we're going to accommodate up to 10 species, 10 to 20, and maybe 20 reactions. The first thing to say is that all these species here are independent species. So in that sense, reduced schemes, even so you call them reduced, they are actually much more powerful than tabulation methods in which you have only 2 independent variables. In a reduced scheme, you can have up to 10 independent chemical species, which can vary the way they want. For example, if you inject an additional species somewhere, it will be taken into account. Even so, you cannot do that in the tabulation method. You have to stay in the limits of the tabulated flame that you took initially. So, for example, also if you have a heat loss, well, no problem. This will be captured naturally because in all the chemical species reactions that you have here, it's built in. There is no limitation to this approach except that you need the scheme. You need a reduced scheme. So what are reduced schemes exactly? You have heard about it, Moshe talked about it last year. Developing reduced schemes is an old story. You actually, at Princeton, I think it's important to mention Fred Dwyer here. There's an old paper in 81 here where he was trying basically to write schemes for hydrocarbons with a limited number of reactions, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And there's a famous paper also by Jones and Lindstedt, which is even used today actually, where he was using up to 4 reactions to describe the oxidation of most hydrocarbon in air. In the end, you have to realize that when you do a reduced scheme like that, you're not doing physics. Each individual reaction is not an elementary reaction. It's just a way to make molecules react in a way that we like. And what do we like? We would like to fit the full scheme. And that means we need a full scheme. The question which is interesting in terms of optimization is that how many flame properties can we fit if we have all these constants that we can adjust? Because we are completely free to adjust the constants of the reduced schemes the way we want. It's our choice. It's just a way to tune the equivalent reactions. Well, in general, if you have only one step reaction, one single step reaction with fixed constant, pre-exponential constant, you cannot mimic a lot of things. But if we start tuning the reaction constants, actually we can do much more. So basically what we're going to do, we're going to choose a certain number of species. We try to keep that as small as possible. We're going to, in this list here, keep a certain number of reactions, and we will allow ourselves to modify all the constants just to make them match what we would like to have from the full chemical scheme. So how do we do it in practice? We need to choose targets. If you're doing, for example, a PhD on a premix flame at 300 K and 1 bar, you don't care about other conditions. The only thing you want to have is a scheme which will work for a premix flame at 300 K and 1 bar. And so what you would like it to do, you would like it to give you the right adiabatic flame temperature, because that controls dilatation, so you want to keep that. You want to have the right laminar flame speed, and probably maybe you want to have the right CO2 and CO level in the burn gases, but maybe not. Maybe, if you are just doing, for example, thermoacoustics, you don't care about CO. The important things for thermoacoustics would be to have the laminar flame speed only. So you define the targets. You say, my scheme should do that. Then you use a full chemical scheme as the reference. That means you go in Cortera or in Chemkin, and you compute these things with the full scheme, and then you compute them with the reduced scheme. And you fit the reduced scheme until you match the full scheme. That's a logical idea. And so the idea here is that it's very difficult to build a reduced scheme which will match all properties of a full scheme over all conditions. And that's the problem when you talk to chemists. A chemist, if he wants to write a paper, he cannot write a paper to match data at 1 bar and 300 K. He needs to produce a scheme which works for all conditions. We don't need that. Not interested. We just want one case. But we want it cheap. And so you see that the objective of the community of people doing kinetic schemes is not, these objectives are not really collinear with our objectives. This is why we have problems to have them do what we want. So how does it work in practice? So we take the full scheme for our chemistry, we take the reduced schemes, and we play with the constant of the reduced schemes until we match the target flames. And then when this works, we say, okay, let's go to the turbulent case now. And the nice property there is that when we go to the turbulent case, the chemistry is simple. We don't need to worry about tabulation. This will be captured right away. Note that complex chemistry, including here the full chemistry, stops under that line. When we go to the 3D code, we use only the reduced scheme, of course. And we believe, we hope that if we match the target flames, for example, the flame speed and the adiabatic flame temperature, you might even add the effect of stretch, for example, on the flame speed, then it will be okay here. This idea is not so different from what you do in tabulation also. In tabulation, I told you, we assume the universality of manifolds. It's about the same thing we do here. Now, why does that work? Well, because it's not ambitious, okay? It's pragmatic. The reduced scheme has certainly a limited range of validity, and if tomorrow you need to do a simulation at 400K, well, you will need another reduced scheme. But who cares? You know, the reduced scheme, if you can save billions of hours, it's okay to build a new scheme every time you need a new one. And again, I've said that yesterday, you know, you don't want to be a perfectionist here. You have to recognize that this description of chemistry may not be the worst thing we'll be doing in the code, okay? So you don't want to waste all your effort just trying to bring more chemistry into your problem. Just want the minimum chemistry you need to be reasonable. And this you know, but normally you should know your targets. You should know what should be conserved in your chemistry. There are, of course, similarities between tabulation methods and reduced schemes. They're all based on these flamelet IDs. They're all based on the idea that if you match what's going on in a laminar flame, then you should be fine when you go to a turbulent flame. And as I said, even this idea is not that clear. But again, it's the best we can do. In one case, we do it at the level of the manifold. That means at the level of the species themselves. In reduced schemes, we don't care about the manifold. We only care about the targets. And we say, if we conserve the targets, we'll be fine. In practice, of course, the implementation is different. The tabulation methods will use the trajectories and the reduced number of variables. And as I said, the reduced schemes will use much more independent species. They will also be more sensitive to numerical errors, as I mentioned before, because since they're using Arrhenius weights, these things are stiff in terms of numerical implementation. So that could be difficult. The nice thing about this method is that if you have, for example, heat losses, temperature will go down. Temperature is explicitly written in the Arrhenius weights here, so it will be naturally captured. While here, if you want to do heat losses, you need to build a new manifold and add one dimension to your problem. So let me show you some examples that were obtained with very single-step reactions. It will be for methane air flames first. So that's a complicated one. Okay? You've seen that before. You react CH4 plus air. This is equivalence ratio, and this is the adiabatic flame temperature which you get with full chemistry, and this is what you get with single-step chemistry. So you see, again, right away you are good on the lean side, and on the rich side you're just off by 300K. So normally it's not good. But if if you're looking at a lean combustor, premixed, perfectly premixed, you don't care. I mean, you can compute here, and you know you're right. So why bother to do better than that? Again, so that will be the whole description of chemistry. I like this slide because usually people doing chemistry, they show you a slide, you can read the reactions at 300 per page, where we only have one. But this one is enough to capture the flame speed and the flame temperature. So why should we carry more? It costs a lot of money if we don't need it. Again, you see it's important when you talk to chemists, to make them understand that for certain problems you don't need all the chemistry. So you must be able to simplify the chemistry. So this is a comparison after that when you start improving. This is a different equivalence ratio here, a different temperature. So it's a different scheme. But this scheme, does correctly for the flame speed, and it does correctly for the flame temperature until 0.8. So if you are below 0.4 and 0.8, you can use this scheme directly, and it won't be a problem. Now also, there's another point I want to mention, and you don't want to be too precise again on flame speeds, because even the chemists don't agree on what the flame speed should be. Even the experimentalists don't really know. Professor Lowe knows about that. When you plot all the flame speed that you measure for the simplest flame ever that anyone computed, which is CH4 plus air at 1 bar at 300K, this is the dispersion of the results. So you see, even if you have a reduced scheme which is not perfect, no one will tell you, well, it's wrong, because no one knows what the flame speed is really in a system like this. You know, the margin of the error margin is small here for the stoichiometric flame, for example. But if you're doing a lean flame, the dispersion of results is quite strong. So you shouldn't be, again, too much of a perfectionist trying to match one result with one full scheme, because actually this scheme might not be the right one. So here, if you put the single-step chemistry approximation, the message is really, if you're lean, go for it. It will work. But then maybe you want to do better than that. You can say, okay, I want to be very, very ambitious. I want to use 2 reactions. Again, I hope there are not too many chemists in the room. So the second reaction is the best I can do, is the equilibrium between CO2 and CO. Why did we plug it here? Well, because we know that in the burn gases here, if you plug the equilibrium between CO2 and CO, the temperature drops from here to there. In other words, until now, 1.3 with this reaction included here and this species, which is CO, then you get all the right temperatures in the adiabatic flame. So right away, just by adding this thing, and this is what we do now in most flames, we always use this equilibrium between CO and CO2, we are able to capture the reaction, the temperature over a wider range. And now the scheme gets bigger, okay, 2 reactions. That's, again, to code that in the Fortran code takes about 5 seconds. And so this is the temperature you get here. You see it's much better in the high equivalence ratio zone. And the flame speed, you know, is reasonable again. Compared to the approximations in that field, it's quite sufficient. And if you even start looking at the fraction of CO, N2, H2O, etc., you see that you're doing reasonably well between the full scheme and the reduced scheme. So it's quite sufficient. If you're not interested in the details of chemistry, go for this one. It's going to do the work, and again, it's sufficient. Now the problem is that you want maybe to do better than that, and you can actually. You want to say, I would like to have a scheme which works now not only at 1 pressure and 1 temperature. I would like it to work over a wide range of pressures and temperatures. How do I do that? Well, that's an idea actually that the theoreticians have proposed a long time ago. You know, Linian and Williams, the kings of theory in that field. They said you can keep a scheme which is small, but maybe you can tune all the constants of the scheme. That means the pre-exponential constant, the activation energy, and the exponents of the fuel mass fraction and oxidizer mass fraction. So we did actually a simplified version where we touched only the pre-exponential constants. In other words, we said this constant here, which must be a constant if it's an elementary reaction, it's not going to be a constant. I'm going to tune it a little bit. And all the rest will be okay. We won't touch it. So in other words, the constant which is here, we're going to make it a constant of the local equivalence ratio. So it's not a constant anymore. So this is what we did, for example, for kerosene. We have the same scheme for methane. So we have these 2 reactions, and instead of having fixed pre-exponential constants, we allow ourselves to modify the constants. And how do we do that? Well, we compute again all the target flames with the full scheme, all the target flames with the reduced schemes, and we tune the constants until we match what we want to have. So we did that for pressure going from 1 to 10 bar, temperatures from 300 to 800, that's described in this paper. And you see here that with a very limited effort, you're able to match the flame speed here over a range of pressure and temperature extremely well. At least sufficiently well compared to the precision of the full scheme itself. As I said, the full scheme itself is not that reliable. So that really means that for almost nothing, again, the Fortran lines, it's maybe 10 lines, you're able to incorporate chemistry in your code. And that's an easy way to do things. So what about the plus and minuses of this method? The plus, as I said, it's extremely cheap. And this is why we see a lot of people using our scheme just because it's cheap. You know, you just plug it in your code, it takes 5 minutes. There is no assumption on regime, and that's a more interesting comment here. When we do that, we don't assume that the flame has to be premixed, diffusion, non-adiabatic, or whatever. It doesn't mean the flame will work for all these regimes, but it's not built like the manifold for tabulation methods, only for one case. It should work in all cases. It can work in all cases. It's more intuitive also. You don't need to make all these assumptions on the manifold. And The other nice thing also is that the users must know the limit of their flames. In other words, they must have defined the targets to know what they're doing. The minus is that it cannot be used if you don't have a full scheme. If you don't have a full scheme, but if you don't have a full scheme, you cannot do anything anyway. You cannot even do a tabulation method because you don't have a scheme. And you might need more and more species in reaction to reach the goals you have. That's more interesting. For example, here I've shown you that for the lean case, you can have flame speeds with 1 reaction and 5 species. But if you want to have adiabatic flame temperatures correctly, you need 2 reactions and 6 species. And if the number of reactions increases, at some point you might have a problem. So let me show you, for example, the case of CH4O2 flames. CH4O2 flames, you don't have nitrogen anymore. And the first thing you're looking at is, can you match the adiabatic flame temperature? So this is a classical plot where you put here the mixture fraction. You create a mixture of gases between the CH4 and O2. You burn it, and you look at the place where you go. You can construct this thing with a Equil package in Chemkin, for example. And here is the true result. So if you mix CH4 and O2, at the stoichiometric level, you will go to 2800K, and this is the curve you should have. Now, if you want to mimic, it's not even a problem of number of species. As you know, the adiabatic flame temperature does not depend on the species. It depends on the kinetic scheme. It depends only on the species that you use, because it's an equilibrium computation. It does not depend on the speed. So for example, if you start by only 5 species, CH4O2CO, CO2, H2O, which is what we use for methane air flames, well, it's really bad. Okay? You go to 3600. So here you have an error of 800K. You plug that in your 3D code, the temperature will be wrong by 800K. It will really start looking bad. Okay? So you say, maybe I should use 6 species. You add H2. Well, you go here. And if you add O, you go here. And if you add H, you go here. Which means basically that for this system, you would need at least all these species in your scheme. You could say, well, it's not a problem, except that once you have the species, you have to find the reactions. And then it gets more interesting. Which reaction should you keep? Because you have a lot of combination between all these species. Well, you have to go back to talk to a chemist, try to convince him to give you 2 hours to tell you what are the most important reactions that you should keep in a reduced scheme in which you would have all these species. And that's tough, because usually the guy ends up telling you you need 200 reactions. And then you're stuck. So this reduced method might work, but it's not that simple. Another problem that you have is that if you have here only one constant, it's easy. But if you start having n reactions, and you start playing also with these exponents here, you may end up with 4n coefficients to determine. If n is equal to 10, you're going to end up with 40 constants. So now there are 2 solutions. You can ask the PhD student to find them by trial and error. But that doesn't work very well, because as you know, flames are very sensitive to the coefficients. There are much more cases where the flame does not exist when you do that, so you have to find a way. One method to do that is to use, for example, genetic algorithm. We did that a while ago. We basically use samples here. Each sample is a set of reduced scheme coefficients, and then you can play them and compare them to the full scheme. And you let the computer basically run the adaptation loop here of genetic algorithm until you converge to a scheme in which you have all the reactions. So this is an example here where we are computing things for Grimec, where the target were to have the right flame speed, the right temperature, the right CO, the right CO2 level, and we had 3 levels of occurrence ratio. So you put that as a cost function, you compute them with Grimec, and then you compute them with your reduced scheme, and you try to change all coefficients until you converge. It's an interesting game, because here you have a sample where we have 15 individuals per generation. We have 200 generations. That means we computed 3,000 flames here. And you see, for example, for the fitness function, that we converge here to a good result in which the fitness function, that means the efficiency, is the best. And when you look, for example, at one of the parameters, the activation energy of the second equation, you see that all things converge here to one value. It doesn't always work that well, but you can, if you need to fit a lot of reactions in a reduced scheme, that can be a good solution. So you end up with this kind of agreement I've shown before, CO2, CO, flame temperature, flame speed, which is quite reasonable, and it's obtained automatically, not by the PhD student. But the PhD student has to write the code which does it automatically. Then, of course, even if you have the right adiabatic flame temperature, you want to have NO, in which case you need to add Zeldovich mechanism, but that's easy, we've done it. It's only doing in the burn gases. And if you want to have auto-ignition time, then it gets more difficult. You know that if you have a limited number of reactions, getting, for example, the property of ignition times at cold values is difficult. Well, you can do it. If you want to have soot, then much more. The main problem we have is that kinetics experts are just not interested. They don't like to do these schemes, too simple for them. So they are more interested in adding one reaction to the 10,000 they already have. So we have problems to find people willing to do that, because still it would be much more efficient if it would be done by a specialist of kinetics. And again, as I said, the whole idea is that if it works in laminar flows, it will work in turbulent flows. That's something which is not proved, but that's what we do today. Stiffness. There's a big problem with reduced schemes. The people reducing schemes, they try to match laminar flames, but don't really look at the constant they end up using. For example, some of these reduced schemes in the paper of Jones and Lindstedt have negative exponents here. They have a minus something. So you can imagine if the species is not there, you have 0 to the power minus something that blows up right away. So the fact that you optimize on the target flames might lead to schemes which are extremely stiff, stiffer than the elementary reactions. And that, in that case, it's a problem because, of course, in the 3D code, it will be a big problem. In the end, when you plug all that in your code, you will see that the problem is not to add one more species. The problem is to be able to resolve the flame fonts, and you have to look at the thickness of the flame font. I haven't talked about that, but if you add one species like the H atom, and the H atom lives on a 2 micron zone, then you're stuck, because you won't be able to put all the points there. Not only the points, but then also the time steps will go to 0. So even if you build a reduced scheme, you have to worry about the numerical resolution that you will need behind it. Okay, so let me go now to the last part here, which is the high-performance computing aspects of all that. All these things, when you bring them to 3D cases, are very expensive. So you need to have a big computer. And CPU time is very important here, and parallel computation have been the source of a major revolution in the last 10 years. If you look actually at the ASCII projects in the United States, which are basically all the money that the government here is giving to high-performance computing, you will find out that combustion is everywhere. Probably more than half of the projects. It can be combustion in the galaxies, combustion in gas turbines, combustion for high-speed propellant, but combustion is everywhere. So combustion is really a field where if you're doing simulations, I don't really see how you can escape from parallel computing, okay? It's just impossible for me to believe that if you can do a 3D code and not have to port it to a parallel machine at some point. So the equations that we're solving, you've seen them before. We have typically n equal 10 to 100 species, and we need to do that for a turbulent flow, and we need to do that in 3D. A specificity of the method that we use is that there is a very intense communication between the processors in this system. We use domain decomposition. That means we're going to cut space in different elements, and all the elements have to talk together. Not all methods on parallel computing work that way. Many methods are almost independent, don't require a lot of communication. For combustion, we have a lot of communication, and that's a problem. If you look also at the number of things that you have to store, 100 million cells, 20 variables, a million time step, we talk about 10 to the power 16 unknowns. So if you do a thesis on 3D LES, you should buy a big disk. Okay? You should actually buy multiple big disks. The conclusion quite often is that you won't be able to store all this data. You will have to make decisions on what you keep, on what you don't keep. And the other thing I mentioned is this intense communication between cores. The other message I want to give here, because that's been our experience, is that every time you multiply the number of processors by 10, you need to write another code, basically. Not completely, but things which work here won't work there, etc., etc. And so, like, since these guys in the HPC community keep increasing the number of cores every 2 years, well, it's a big effort to catch up on that. That means that there's a layer in your code that you have to change every time a new machine shows up. And the technology working on n cores won't work on 10 n cores, okay? Your professor will say, I don't understand, it was working on 1,000, should work on 10,000. No, it doesn't work that way. So let me give you an example. That's a very simple one. It was given to me by the guy at Surfax developing the code because he wanted people to understand where the problem was. Very simple. You want to compute the time step in an explicit code. The time step should be such that everywhere in the flow, the single time step that you have should be such that the sound speed multiplied by the time step divided by delta x depends on nu. Nu is the CFL, it's of the order of unity. This is one value for the whole flow. This depends on the point, delta x, and A depends on the point. So that the formula that you need to use is delta t must be the minimum of CFL multiplied by cell size divided by sound speed. Looks simple. If you're doing that on your PC, you just write a loop saying delta t equal minimum of that. But on a parallel machine, there is no processor which knows all these things. Each processor knows the sound speed and the mesh size in its domain, not of the neighbor. So you need to gather, that's what we call gather the information. You need to ask everyone, give me your information. So if you're a processor, I need to ask you, send me all your sound speed and all your sizes. Same thing, same thing, same thing. Once I got all the data, one of the processors must do this formula, and then it needs to send back the information. Oh, the time step is 10 minus 8, the time step is at 10 minus 8, etc. And as you see, this works fine if you don't have too many processors. But here, for example, this is a computation of a Siemens engine when you get 7,000 cores. All the pieces you see here are different cores. Okay, this is computed on one core, on another one, etc. You see only the skin. Inside you have 7,000 processors like this. So in the old days, our code was written in that way. We had a master and what we call slaves. The master was basically doing the common tasks and distributing this information to the slaves. Today, it's actually completely gone. We have a different structure. Everything I'm going to tell you today was working on 10,000. When we moved to 100,000, we had to throw everything away. So let me show you how this works. You are at the end of a time step. What everyone is doing, the master says, hey, send me information. So everyone gives the sound speed and the size of all points to the master. The master computes the time step. He has all the information. And then he has to send it back. So what does he do? He's taking the information, sending it to 1, sending it to 2, etc. And the trick when he does that is that he has to do that one after the other. When you do it for 10 processors, it's easy. You do it for 100 processors, it's easy. You do it for 10,000, everyone is waiting, you know, because that means basically I have to come and talk to him, give him the time step. All of you are waiting. Then I do the same here. Same. If you are 100, it's okay. If you are 10,000, that takes much too much time. So what we found out is that we never had any problem with this part until we reached 10,000. And then at 10,000, we found out that this process, which is very small normally in the code, it's just a simple loop, was taking 20% of the CPU time. But in the code, there are many other parts which look like this one. We need to gather and scatter information. So the code was basically, the efficiency was dropping. We were going faster on 1,000 cores than we were going on 10,000. So that didn't make sense. Normally, we should go 10 times faster. In that case, we were going more slowly. So how do you fix this problem? Well, you stop talking to CFD people, you go talk to a computer science guy, and the guy just laughs at you. And you say, hey, you're a beginner guy. That's the way you should do it. Okay, the way to do it, I tell you the time step, okay? But then, instead of sitting there, you just give the time step to your neighbor behind you while I give him the time step. In which case, now this guy has a time step, and he can give you to another guy, and this is what we call collective distribution of information. And this will go much faster than if I have to do all the job, okay? And this method actually allows to cut the price of this operation by a huge factor, typically 100, 200, 1,000. And so, by the way, by doing this distribution of the information, you can cut the cost of the simulation by a very large number. And you're happy. So the guy in charge of the code comes to you, shows you that, and you say, it's great. And then the guy says, wait a second. The problem is that this distribution here of the information depends on the machine. The lines that you use to do that on a Blue Gene Q and on a Silicon Graphics and on an HP machines are different. So you say, okay, why do I care? Well, you do care because if you have 200 people using this code, and each of them is using a different machine, you end up with multiple versions of the same code that you need to distribute to multiple users. After 3 months, you're dead. Because if you have to distribute versions of the code which differ for each machine, it's crazy. So again, it will work for one PhD one time, but in the business that we do, that we try to keep code for a long time to distribute it to a number of people, you have to find a way to do that in a generic way. And so you end up not doing any combustion anymore. You end up doing, computer science, I guess. But there's no way you can escape that. As a PhD student, I will come to that in a minute, you have two choices. Either you do everything on your own, good luck, or you have to work with people who have done it before for you. So what we've seen in Europe, especially in France, is that this business of the difficulty to parallelize our codes has been basically shaping our community. We don't work anymore with one professor plus one PhD student and one postdoc. That doesn't work for these big codes. We work in a much more collaborative way. This is, for example, something we started in France, where we have basically two big codes, one developed at Surfax, one developed at Coria in Rouen, and we distribute these codes to all users in France so that they can have a code right away to start with instead of having to do everything on their own. This is also the reason which allows us, for example, to run, we just run here on 1 billion cells on the BGQ at Argonne on 65,000 processors and 120,000, I guess, last week. And we're running on all machines. And the reason we do that is that it's done together. We have a lot of people collaborating on the same code. And that's very complicated. Just the management of the sources, for example, takes a lot of time. That means in France, the way we organize is the following. We have these two codes. They are distributed to different companies. They are distributed to all the labs which want them. And we use this code after that on the French machines and on the Insight machines. There's a big initiative in Europe called Praise here, where you can have free CPU time on the largest machines. So typically, you can have 30 million CPU hours if you want to do a big computation. You have the same thing in the US through Insight, except that Insight is more selective than Praise. I don't know how you would do that, but finding CPU time is going to be an issue. For EVBP, for example, this is the labs which are using this code. This is the industry using the code. And Surfax is the place where we maintain this code. And we get maybe 4 or 5 people that are just there to do that. Do all these stupid things I mentioned about parallelism, maintain the sources, distribute the code, etc. So that's a big issue. Then after that, when you have a code to do that, you can go to Argonne, for example, compute on these huge machines. And again, they keep increasing every year. They are there. They are for free. The United States always tries to stay at the forefront in that field. So these machines are there. You don't have to pay for CPU, but you need the code to run on them. That's a major problem. Last comment here. It's a big discussion actually in the community. I've been talking about turbulent combustion models yesterday for a long time. But if the power of the computers keeps increasing, you could think that probably you could perform DNS everywhere. In which case, you don't even need to talk about models. I mentioned that yesterday. One of the ideas of the second flame model is basically this one, that as time goes by, we can decrease the seconding factor, in which case we will end up with DNS. The thing which worries me, and I will come back to that, is that too many computations, too many computer computations make you stupid after a while. I think it's dangerous to have a lot of people just computing. I think we need to keep people thinking about theory. It's true that if you look at the conversion community today, the number of people doing theory, exactly that you've seen with Moshe, for example, people who are able to think about the problem without any computer is going down. And it's a shame. I think we have too many people doing computations and not enough doing theory. And probably some of you in the room want to go there. I think it's a good thing to do. We see also less and less people trying to use turbulence models. I didn't mention that. You know that the K-epsilon model is not the only model. You can write a higher order model, stress tensors. It's been, 20 years ago, everyone was doing stress tensors. I think today, almost no one does it anymore. And it's too bad because you might need these tools. You cannot only rely on the fact that you're going to have big computers. That's not going to work. Okay, I think it's all I wanted to say on chemistry and HPC. Is there a question at this point? Otherwise, I will use the last. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned about reduced schemes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of, I think, a branch is dynamically reduced mechanism, right? And every location, maybe every step,
Yep.
every 10 steps, you reduce the full scheme dynamically.
Sure.
So I want to know what's your comments on that based on HPC? Is that better than tabulation?
We haven't been able to use that today in full 3D codes, okay? But that's an interesting track. The problem when you do that is that the complexity remains very large. Quite often, yeah, the question was, can we use dynamically reduced schemes instead of the schemes you've seen that? These dynamically reduced schemes, they start from the full scheme, but the problem is that they are reduced, but they are not very much reduced, okay? They are reduced, but not to the point which I've seen here. And actually, the chemists, when they reduce schemes, they stop still too far away from us. You know, we want 10 reactions, 6 species, but they come on with 50 reactions and 50 species or 100. So there's a gap in between here that these guys don't want to go to because they say it's going to be too dirty, we don't want to do it. But obviously, after that you will okay, there will be another, even if the method would work, you would have to worry about the efficiency on the big system. Dynamically reducing the chemistry for us is not an option on the long term. If you compute 10 times the same chamber, you're not going to reload the table at the same time. You still need to reduce it and to store it, so that you don't need to redo the job at each computation. But that's something we're looking at. But for the moment, it's not operational in our codes. Another question?
I remember you mentioned just before last break that the branch cannot be parallelized beyond 100 cores. Can you explain the reason?
Okay. There are different points there. Since ones today can run in the night, the push, the need to make it faster is not very strong in industry, because the engineer will always leave at night and come back the following morning. The second problem with ones is that it's usually using an implicit method, and implicit method is difficult to parallelize by nature. You can do it, but you need a lot of effort, and commercial companies are always looking at how much money it will bring back compared to how much it will cost them, and it's not clear that it's worth doing it. The last problem also is that today the model for codes, commercial codes, is that you pay per core, you pay per license. So, and people, if you don't want to buy 10,000 Fluent licenses, the price would be crazy. So up to now, commercial companies have not yet reached the point where they will sell you one license which can work on 10,000 processors. They want you to buy 10,000 licenses. So people say, no way, I can't afford it. You're talking about billions here. So for the moment, what we see actually in France, GLES codes today are faster than the ones codes we use there, just because we use more processors. Any other question before we start talking about instabilities and thermoacoustics? Yes?
Can you also explain the progress variable again? When do people use the progress variable, and how do you define the burden state in a realistic way?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the level at which this. The question is, what is the progress variable, and how do you define it? The progress variable is very well defined if you're using unity-Lewis number single-step reaction. It goes from 0 in the fresh, 1 in the burnt. As soon as you have more than one-step reaction, as soon as you have equilibrium which are complicated or even heat losses, defining the progress variable becomes difficult. Because, for example, in a flame where you have Lewis number effects, the temperature might be higher than the adiabatic flame temperature. So the progress variable, if you define it with temperature, T minus T1 divided by T2 minus T1, could go to 1.1. Then, this is why people don't use temperature. They prefer to use species like CO2. If you use CO2 alone is not sufficient, then you use CO plus CO2. So again, the problem is always, we had the same discussion with Professor Lowe a few minutes ago. When you are in the nice framework of the theory, where Lewis numbers are equal, single-step reaction, you can define a very nice mixture fraction and a very nice progress variable. When you go to real flames, there is no such thing as a good mixture fraction, and there is no such thing as a good progress variable. And you have to rely on people who tried different solutions and tell you, for example, for premix flame, CO plus CO2 is a good choice. But for example, temperature is not. Temperature definitely is not monotonous, so it would be crazy. Okay, so we still have 10 minutes to start talking about instabilities, and that will be a big topic for today and tomorrow. And basically, I will separate instabilities in two parts. One of them will be thermoacoustics, which I believe is the most important unstable phenomenon in flames, and the other one is all the other instabilities. And I want to talk about all the other instabilities before I go into thermoacoustics. Just to remind you that instabilities are intrinsically found in every mechanical system. You know? The problem of engineer is that we design system to be stable, but it's not always the case. Okay, you probably all know this famous image here of American engineering.
Civil engineering.
Civil, yeah. Everything we design, basically, we design it to work on a certain regime, and we hope it to stay there. And the problem is that certain modes of the system can be unstable, grow, and lead to problems. If you go to fluid mechanics and you leave the field of civil engineering, since you have flows, we also have quite a few unstable mechanisms which can be problems. You've all seen all these famous pictures by Rochko, where you see vortices. That's the classical Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, where a flow, instead of saying just like this being parallel, starts creating vortices. But it's not the only one. In a combustion chamber, you have instabilities between the fuel and the air, if you're injecting liquid fuel. And of course, in kinetics, you've seen that in the course of Moshe, planar flame fronts never remain planar. In most cases, they start doing cells. That's also an instability, thermodiffusive instabilities. I've talked also during the introduction about structures, the vibration of the combustor walls, for example, which can couple with the flames. When people start looking at combustion instabilities, they classified basically them in three big classes. The first one is what they call intrinsic instabilities, things which are related to the flame itself. That means if the flame is doing a cell, like in a premix flame, for example, in a premix flame front, that's an intrinsic mode. But you can also have chamber instabilities. What is a chamber instability? It's a mode which is due to the whole flame, and that's really the one I will be talking about later, where the vortices are created in the flame chamber, they interact with the walls, and the whole thing starts oscillating, but that remains within the chamber. And then you can have system instabilities. That's the case where not only the combustor, but the whole propulsion system, for example, is involved. The classical example is the Pogo instability. So, of course, this is long wavelengths, mid wavelengths, and short wavelengths. You know, a few millimeters, a few centimeters, a few meters. So the Pogo effect is a classical one. In the Pogo effect, you can have oscillations here of combustion, which shake the structure so much that the flow rate of fuel, which is injected in the engine, starts also oscillating, in which case the engine itself starts oscillating more, and the system gets unstable, and the structure can explode. And this is a well-known phenomenon in rockets, where this loop here can lead to unpleasant consequences. Vibration in general are not good. I don't know if I have sound here. This is an example. Let me get it here. I've lost the sound. Strange. Okay, you don't need the sound to understand what's going on. This is vibration in an helicopter. As you can see, if things start vibrating, it's not a good idea in general. So system instabilities is something you want to avoid. It seems like the pilots were complaining, but these guys are always complaining. So. Another example, I think that's a famous paper that you probably heard about, of a much smaller instability. This is the growth of a laminar flame. If the Lewis number is right, you will have a smooth flame, and if the Lewis number is not right, you start seeing these cells here, which are one type of instability, okay, of combustion instability. The trick about these instabilities that you see here, you can see them experimentally here. You can see them also numerically on flame fronts, which instead of remaining planar, they get all these funny shapes on it. And an interesting point is, when we go to a turbulent flame, do we care? Or could we forget about them? Well, actually, that's an open question. We know that the fact that these cells appear on flame fronts is controlled by the Lewis number. And we know that if the Lewis number is less than typically 0.5, then we can have formation of cells. And whether they play a role or not in a turbulent flame is unclear. We've done some DNS, for example, here, of a flame propagating into turbulence with and without thermodiffusive instability. And we see that when you have thermodiffusive instability, you get more surface. So it seems that the laminar instabilities that we observe on laminar flames can interact somehow with the turbulence. They do the same thing, okay? Both of them create wrinkling, not for the same reasons, but they can interact. The point today is that in most cases we don't include them in turbulent combustion models. I don't think that there is a turbulent combustion model which really accounts for that. Instead, well, maybe a few corrections, but it's not there. Another kind of instability here coming from the group in Marseille, where they propagate a flame in a tube. So it's a long tube, and you ignite the flame at the top. And so the flame goes down, and depending on the equivalence ratio, it can do different things. As you can see here. So you see here that not the same thing happened in two cases, okay? Now we're going to look at the flame much more slowly. This is tomography, so you see the flame shape. Now, it has cells here, exactly like the one you saw in the picture of Professor Lowe, but then it gets coupled to the acoustics in the burner. And you see these oscillations are due to the fact that it gets coupled to the acoustics, and the acoustics make it flat, actually. And then you see other structures. It's another unstable mode. We're going to move again to the top. And you see the acceleration will come when these tongues will get very large here. The flame surface will increase. And then, of course, things will get much faster, and you end up with this fast flame that you've seen. In a system like this, you get all kinds of instabilities. The mechanism of these guys is not the same as the mechanism you saw at the beginning of the movie. But all of these mechanisms are not that important when you go to real flames in 3D burners. Another mode, of course, of instability is this puffing mode in fires that you see in all movies. It's actually on Earth. You can predict the frequency of this thing. It's 10 Hertz or 15 Hertz. It's a good way, actually, when you look at a movie from Hollywood to see if it's an animation or a real one. You can measure the frequency of the puffs, and it doesn't match, you know it's an animation. Instabilities also occur in other places. That's another way of looking at the problem. Instability in a piston engine is when you have a lot of cycles, but then from time to time, one cycle goes crazy. You have here an example of that. This is a case where we have a large variability from cycle to cycle. This is the flame here. You see this flame gets cut in two, actually. And on the right-hand side, you have an engine which is much more stable. So, of course, all cycles are different. We slow down the speed when you go to the combustion phase. And you see here, for example, this flame gets quenched at this cycle. It did not get quenched at the previous cycle. So which means that when we're going to plot the pressure curves, we're going to get different results. And that's very unpleasant in industry because they would like each cycle to be the same. You see, this one is different. While for this engine, all cycles are almost the same. So the variability is much less. So that's another type of variability that we would like to avoid. But the one I really want to talk about, because this is the most fun, is this one. This is what we call thermoacoustics. Those are engines which were not designed like that at the beginning. And the consequences of combustion instabilities there, of course, is that you just kill the engine. And that's, of course, something you want to avoid. So that's what I will describe after the break, I guess, because it's more than time to stop. So if there is a question, I'll take it. Otherwise, we meet again in 15 minutes. Any question for the moment? OK, we meet in 15 minutes.